You know, the greatest sermon that was ever preached was preached by a preacher who was sitting down. That's the Sermon on the Mount. Whoever originated the idea of preachers having to stand up is beyond me. But it's grown that way, and that's what is usually done. Now, we're going to study this afternoon Daniel, the 11th chapter. If those at the back can't see too well, there's some extra good seats up in the front, if you like, but you please yourself where you sit. Actually, Daniel 10 and 11 are linked. The introduction is in the 10th chapter, and then it leads into the 11th, because when you come down to verse 21, we have the angel explaining to Daniel just what he is going to do. Verse 21 of Daniel 10, "But I will show thee which is noticed in the scripture of truth." That's a good phrase, the scripture of truth. "And there is none that holdeth with me in these things but Michael your prince." Now, when you come down to 11 and verse 2, the angel said, "And now will I show thee the truth." But he's been giving the truth all the time. What does he mean by it? He means this, that he's going to give it in plain, simple language. You see, Daniel, it starts in with the great image, and then you have the 4 beasts, and in Daniel 8 and 9 you have the 2 beasts. But now he's going to give it in plain, simple language. Remember, Daniel 11 is a literal prophecy in plain, literal language. There is no symbols used. There is no beasts or images or anything like that. It's plain, straight-out truth. You often find that in a prophecy that is dealing with symbols, like in Revelation. When you come to the closing chapters, it sums it up in plain, literal language. For instance, Revelation 20, dealing with 1,000 years, that's literal. That's not symbolic time, or you'd have a tremendous period. But it's plain, literal language, and describing the holy city and the New Jerusalem, it is in plain, literal language. Isn't that so? You see, some people want to spiritualize it. I meet some even professed Adventists that will tell you that the New Jerusalem is symbolic or it's spiritual. But it's a literal city, isn't it? Jesus is a literal person in heaven. And heaven is a real place, and we'll be real people there, won't we? We'll eat and drink in your Father's kingdom. We're real people. The man Christ Jesus is real. And so in Daniel, the last great prophecy is given in plain, literal language. You'll see that as we go through. For instance, verse 2 again, "And now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia." Now, there's nothing symbolic in that. It doesn't say there's 3 horns that symbolize 3 kings that'll stand up, as in Daniel 8 or Daniel 7. You see that? There are 3 kings that will yet stand up in Persia. "And the 4th shall be far richer than they all." That 4th king was the king Ahasuerus, the one that married Esther. When you read this prophecy, think of Esther, and you remember the great king. He was so wealthy that if he couldn't conquer a country or didn't want to conquer it, he could buy it out. He could buy an army. And he bought armies that ran into literally millions of soldiers. He could pay for anything. He was probably one of the richest men that ever lived. "And the 4th shall be richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up against the realm of Grecia." Because of his riches, he wanted to expand his kingdom, and he crossed the Bosphorus, the old Hellespont, over into Europe, and he attacked Greece. In fact, he burned Athens. And because of that, he stirred up the Grecian power. This is the Medo-Persian power. Babylon is gone. Medo-Persia is ruling, and it brings you through to the last king of Persia. And as it says in the last part of verse 2, that through his riches he shall stir up against the realm of Grecia. And he stirred Greece up. For a young king came to the throne by the name of Alexander the Great, and because of what Ahasuerus had done to Athens, he determined that he would smash the Medo-Persian Empire. Verse 3, and a mighty king shall stand up. Now, you'll find 3 times in Daniel 11 it mentions that a king stands up. Every time it mentions that, it is a new power coming onto the stage. You see, Medo-Persia is finished. And now you've got a new power, you've got Greece. Now, we're after this new power that's coming up. A mighty king shall stand up. It's a new power coming up because Medo-Persia had stirred up Greece. And now you've got the Grecian Empire coming on the stage of action. And Alexander was a mighty king. He was a dynamo of energy. He was a 20th century man before his time. Nothing would stop Alexander. He was besieging a city once, and his messengers came in and told him what a mighty fortress it was, what fortifications. They didn't think that it would be possible for them to break in. Alexander said, can the sun shine in? Oh yes, they said the sun can shine in. Well, he said, if the sun can get in, we'll get in. And he got in and overthrew it. Nothing would stop Alexander the Great. A mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. He was supreme. That expression too, I think, is 3 times mentioned in Daniel 11, and it's always talking about a new power that will do according to his will. We'll notice it probably as we go through. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken. When he reaches the pinnacle, his kingdom would be broken, and shall be divided unto the 4 winds. You remember in Daniel 7, that beast that symbolized Greece had 4 heads. Here you've got it divided to the 4 winds. The same expression, the same thought. It shall be divided to the 4 winds and not to his posterity. Alexander's relatives disappeared when he did. When he was lying on his deathbed, one of his generals said to him, to whom goes the kingdom? He said, the strongest can have it. Alexander was hardly cold in his grave when every relative of Alexander was murdered. His 4 wives, their sons, their daughters. In fact, if you had any relationship, blood relationship with Alexander, you died. And the prophecy told it beforehand that when he reached the pinnacle, you remember he got back from into Babylon, and the people cried out, he's not a man, he's a god. And he tried to drink the great Herculean cup of liquor, and he died in a drunken revelry. When his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided towards the 4 winds, and not to his posterity, not according to his dominion, which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides these. He was divided to the 4 winds. And very soon after that, the Alexandrian kingdom, although divided into 4, gradually formed into 2 main powers. And from now on, you'll read about the king of the north and the king of the south. So now, from now on, you'll notice the king of the north and the king of the south. That's why I've explained a little bit in these early verses, because it gives you the key to the whole of Daniel 11. Verse 5, the king of the south shall be strong. Now, you see, the introduction to Daniel 11 lays down a platform that will explain the latter part of Daniel 11. Most people, when they want to present some fantastic idea, they miss the foundation. You see, here you've got the eastern Mediterranean, as we mentioned the other night, down here into Egypt. Jerusalem is over here. Here's the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan, and here is Jerusalem. Now, I'll show you in our later study that Jerusalem was looked on as the center of the earth. In fact, when I was over in Jerusalem, they showed me the very spot where from time immemorial that spot has been looked on as the center of the earth. In fact, geographically, they claim it is the center of the earth. I made a special trip up into Hereford in England to the old Hereford Cathedral to see a map they've got there that goes way back to the days of the Crusades. And there in that map, they have Jerusalem as the center of the earth, radiating out. And geographically, everything in the Bible hinges from Jerusalem. North is north of Jerusalem. South is south of it. East is east, and west is west of Jerusalem. You get it? Now here, from now on, you will read about the king of the south and the king of the north. And the king of the north was the power that inhabited the northern regions. And when Alexander the Great's kingdom broke up into four, north, south, east, and west, it soon came back to the place where the northern power and the southern power were by far the strongest. And in Daniel 11, from now on, we'll read about the king of the north and the king of the south. And south is Egypt. Verse 5. And the king of the south shall be strong, and so on. In verse 6, in the middle, you read about the king of the north. In verse 8, you read about Egypt. And in verse 9, it says, so the king of the south shall come to his kingdom. Egypt is the king of the south. The king of the north is the power to the north. If you miss that, you'll run into confusion. And people speculate a lot about the closing verses, especially the closing verse, and they speculate as to who's the king of the north and the king of the south. You get it? But the Bible shows you clearly what it is in the plain, literal language. Now, we've got to hurry because it's a long prophecy and a big one, but we'll notice one or two outstanding points. You are dealing here with the king of the north and the king of the south. Come down to verse 16. For you've got the king of the north and the king of the south, and the power that followed the breakup of the Grecian Empire was what? Was Rome. Rome came on the stage of action. And he captured the king of the king of the south. Egypt went down there into south, and it captured Palestine. Rome ruled Palestine in the days of Jesus. Isn't that so? Verse 16. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his will. You notice that phrase. It's dealing with a new power coming on the stage of action. For following the Grecian Empire and its breakup was Rome. Now you're on the track of Rome. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his will, and none shall stand before him, for Rome dominated the world. And he shall stand in the glorious land. And he was going to dominate. And it's, in fact, if you go through this prophecy carefully, and you look into history, it's a fantastic story, because the king of the south was opposed to the king of the north. They were fighting each other, just as stated in this prophecy. And the king of the north, from up there in what we would call Turkey today, or Syria, came down against Egypt. But at that time, Egypt was working in closely with Rome. And the northern power came down with a big army. Antiochus Epiphanes. You ever heard of him? In fact, some of them apply some of these prophecies regarding the papacy to Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, at that time, he was the king of the north. He was the king of Syria. And he was coming down to invade Egypt. And the unarmed ambassador of Rome, who was in Egypt, went out into the desert and met him. Met Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus had a whole army behind him of armed men. And the unarmed ambassador of Rome, with only a walking stick in his hand, walked out in front of the army and stopped him and handed him a letter. from the emperor of Rome to tell him to go back. Antiochus read it. He said, I'll think about it. The ambassador with his cane drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus. He said, you'll do your thinking inside that circle. And Antiochus turned on his heel and went back to Syria. A man with a mighty army behind him was chased by an unarmed ambassador. Why? Because just as the Bible said, Rome did according to his will. He was dominating. He took over Palestine too, yes.
So Antiochus was representing the breakup of the Greeks.
Yes, he was the king. You see, there was about 24 kings that ruled there in Syria as the king of the north. He was one of them. But he was the one that had to move out. Now, this is a very wonderful prophecy. We haven't got time to go into all the details. You could go for weeks on Daniel 11 with each phrase. You get it? But we'll take just one or two high points because we've got to get down and deal with the last verses mainly. So that's the ones that we are facing today. You get it? I'm just giving you a little bit of the background. But you notice how it's all in simple, plain, straight-out language, no symbols whatsoever. It's all plain, literal language. Verse 19. Then he shall turn his face towards the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. That was Julius Caesar. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of his kingdom. A raiser of taxes in the glory of his kingdom. Now the New Testament mentions him. You come over now, keep your hand there in Daniel 11 and come over to Luke and you'll see how the New Testament confirms and throws more light on this. Luke chapter 2 and verse 1, for here is the origin of taxation. You know, it's a funny thing, after 2,000 years, you'd think people would have caught on and got to like taxation, but they don't seem to like it. In fact, when I was in America, I heard somebody say, there's only two things you can be sure of in this life. That's taxation and death. That's the only thing you've got. I heard of a man over there who left instruction, and when he died, he left a note. And they were to cremate him and put that note in with his ashes. And they did, and the little box of ashes was sent to the Commissioner of Taxation with the note, now you've got everything. People haven't fallen in love with taxation. But here's the origin. The prophecy in Daniel 11 told about this raiser of taxes. Now in Luke chapter 2 and verse 1, it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. You see, Caesar Augustus dominated the world. You can't tax people if you don't dominate them. Is that so? But Caesar Augustus was the emperor of Rome that now had the world at his feet. And he passed a law that everybody should be taxed. And notice the prophecy again. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of his kingdom. They said Caesar Augustus found Rome in brick. He left it in marble. In fact, our own language today bears out this. We talk about an august assembly. What does that mean? That came from Caesar Augustus. In the glory of his kingdom. You see it? Wonderful. Now we hurry on. Verse 21, in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flattery. When Caesar Augustus was dying, one of his wives was trying to push her son to become the emperor. But Caesar Augustus said that Tiberius was too vile a person to bear the purple of Rome. But through flattery and a smooth tongue, he eventually became the emperor, Tiberius Caesar. And it was in the reign of Tiberius Caesar that Jesus lived. Jesus was born in the reign of Caesar Augustus, as you read in Luke 2, but it was in the reign of Tiberius that Jesus died. The next verse says, verse 22, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, that is the might of armies, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. In the reign of this vile emperor, the prince of the covenant would be broken. Who was that? That was Jesus. And sure enough, to the very letter, it came true. Now you're dealing with Rome in these following verses until you come down to verse 30 or to verse 31. You see, Rome is changing now from pagan to papal when they forsook the Holy Covenant, as mentioned in verse 30. And arms shall stand in his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. What's the sanctuary of strength? That's where Jesus ministers in the gospel. And they would corrupt the gospel. We are dealing now with the papacy, where she would corrupt the great message of the atoning work of Jesus. They shall pollute the sanctuary of strength and shall take away the daily sacrifice. You remember, you've got that in Daniel 8, where they would take away the daily ministration of Jesus. They would counterfeit the whole of the truth of God. Verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. That's a good verse. In fact, I printed off a little writing pad they often send out, and I put that verse in it. And I like to underline, the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. It's a good verse, isn't it? But notice verse 33. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, and by captivity, and by spoil many days. That is taking you down into the dark ages, and they're the very means that Rome used in persecution, isn't it? For many days, for 1260 years. Now, you see, you are down in the reign of the papacy. Verse 35, and some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. Tell me, when did the time of the end begin? 1798. Yes. How do you know? You notice the prophecy here. This is the verse that gives you the beginning of the time of the end. This is your verse. Mark it. To make them white, you see, they were going to suffer persecution, to fall and to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end. The papacy would rule and persecute until the time of the end. The time of the end would begin with the downfall of the papacy. Now, when did the papacy collapse as a political power and a persecuting power? It was when General Berthier marched down there into Rome and took the Pope prisoner. And you know, France did a good job. There was no humbug about it. You don't often hear about it. When Berthier marched there into Rome, and I've been in the very room where he took the Pope prisoner. If you go to Rome, never mind so much about St. Peter's. That's a showpiece. If you want something interesting, go into the castle of St. Angelo. That was the home of the popes for over 1,000 years. That's where you'll see something of the persecutions. And it was a fortress. And the Pope was taken prisoner in there. And General Berthier not merely took the Pope prisoner, but he stripped the rings off his fingers, and they stripped the churches of their wealth. They took the linen out of the churches to make shirts for the soldiers. They fairly stripped them. In fact, when I was over there the last time and wandering around the castle of St. Angelo, you could see the coat of arms of the papacy, and it was all chipped out with like a pick. I thought somebody didn't like the papacy. And I checked up, and lo and behold, it was in 1798 that happened. They chopped it out. In fact, do you know, in 1798, the Pope literally went to hell. Did you know that? Well, he did. And I'll tell you, literally, for it's a literal prophecy. When they were taking the Pope back to France, for they took the Pope in 1798 from Rome back to France. And when they were getting up into the north of Italy, they had planned to house the Pope in a certain building. But there was a big earthquake, and the building was badly damaged. So they couldn't house him there, so they housed him for the night in a place called H-E-L-L, much to the amusement of unbelievers. And in 1798, the Pope literally went to hell. Don't tell Catholics that. So you've got it. 1798. In fact, 1798 is a very vital date, for it changed the whole aspect of Europe. The papacy had been persecuting and dominating, but now the papacy was broken. You get it? And they broke it so hard, they thought that the papacy would never rise. In fact, you've even got it in your Bible. Keep your finger there in Daniel 11 and notice this. Come over to the foreword of the Bible if you've got an old King James version. You notice, you see here it is, you've got the very front here, the Holy Bible. Have you got that? Good. Now come into the next page, and it starts in to the most high and mighty Prince James. Have you got that? The next page. You got it? Good. Now come down 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs. And towards the end of the 4th paragraph, you'll notice there in brackets. Have you got it? Which hath given such a blow unto that man of sin as will not be healed. Can you see that? In brackets, about the 4th line from the bottom of the 4th paragraph. Can you see it? You've got it in most of the older Bibles. Can you see it? You see, the Bible says that his deadly wound, what? Would be healed. They thought they had hit the papacy so hard that it would never rise again, politically. And they were under no illusions about who was the man of sin. Which hath given such a blow unto that man of sin as will not be healed. But the Bible showed it was more correct, but that's what they put there in the preface. And that was in 1798. Now we are back here into Daniel 11. Good. Verse 35. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try and to purge and to make them white. That's the persecution. Even to the time of the end. The power of the papacy as a persecuting power broke in 1798 when the time of the end began. Have you got that? Good. Now we read on. To the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. Verse 36. And the king shall do according to his will. Underline that. When was that? That was in 1798. That's where people get twisted in Daniel 11. For they read on and they say that's the papacy. But as I showed you before, every time that phrase is mentioned in Daniel 11, it is always a new power coming. You see that? The king shall do according to his will. Tell me, In 1798, did the Pope do according to his will? No, never. The Pope wanted to continue ruling and continue persecuting. He didn't do according to his will, but did France? Absolutely. It took the Pope prisoner, and the Pope died in captivity. Now you're on the track of revolutionary France. Good. And the king shall do according to his will, and shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god. Did France do that? She was atheistic. She planned at ruling God out of heaven and capitalism out of the earth. In fact, actually, it is the beginning of socialism. You know, it's an interesting thing. Our government, our federal government, calls itself a socialist government, which is interesting. When I was in Russia and some of those communist countries, I discovered that they don't call themselves communists. They call themselves socialists. Communism is like the ideal, what they're aiming at. It's like Christians aiming at heaven. That's what they're aiming at, but they haven't got there yet. With communism, communism is the ideal that they're aiming at. They say they are socialists today. I come back here to Australia and they say the same thing, and they claim to be atheists. It's interesting, isn't it? And the king shall do according to his will. He'll exalt himself above every god. It was anti-God through and through. Revolutionary France. Hurrying down, for we can't spend too long on the wonders of this prophecy. Verse 37, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. Is that true of Rome? Was that true of the papacy? Never. Never. She didn't disregard the God of her fathers. She claimed to follow in the same tracks. But revolutionary France repudiated the God of their fathers. You see, it won't fit in with the papacy. It won't fit in, but it certainly fits in with revolutionary France. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women. They ruled out marriage. Nor regard any God. Could you say that of the papacy? Never. But was it true of France? Absolutely. Revolutionary. For he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces. Have you got a marginal reading there for forces? What does it say? Oh, munitions. What's that? You know, when Napoleon was heading for Moscow, somebody asked him if God was on his side. He laughed. He said, God's on the side with the heaviest artillery. He honored the God of munitions. You see that? Might is power. He would honor the God of forces. We've got to hurry down. We could pause on all of these, but time marches on. Verse 40. At the time of the end. When is that? 1798. Shall the king of the south push at him? Push at who? Revolutionary France. Shall push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. There you've got like a triangular war. Here is revolutionary France, and the king of the north, the king of the south is pushing at him, and the king of the north comes down like a whirlwind. Now tell me, friends, did France ever fight, or at least did the papacy ever fight Egypt? Never. Never. But in 1798, France went down there and captured Egypt. In fact, if you want something interesting to read, when you are traveling from Sydney down to Melbourne and you cross the border a few miles south or on the Melbourne side of Albury, over to the left you've got a little town called Beechwood. No, that's not Beechworth. It's a very interesting old place. It was the home of Ned Kelly. And they've got a museum there with a whole lot of his relics in it, and they took me over there. But I was especially interested when you go into this little museum, over on the right, under a glass case, they've got some old newspapers. And I went over and had a look at them, because on the top, in big letters, it was the Battle of the Nile. And I looked at the date, 1798. You see, France went down there and took Egypt because she wanted to cut the line of Britain to India, for France was fighting in Britain at that time. You see that? And they captured Egypt to break the connection of Britain with Egypt, the wealth of Egypt. And the British sent down a naval force, and at the mouth of the Nile a battle was fought, and it was called the Battle of the Nile. And that was in 1798. And because Napoleon was defeated then, he aimed at going back to France by land. And he was marching his army up through Palestine to get back. When the Turkish power that was then friendly with Britain came down, and the Battle of Acre was fought, just as the Bible says. At the time of the end, 1798, shall the king of the south push at him, for they fought Napoleon. And the king of the north, this power up there in the north, shall come against him like a whirlwind, and they did, and with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, for that was at the Battle of the Nile when Britain defeated them. And he shall enter, in verse 41, into the glorious land. Now, on this question of the king of the north, some years ago there was a man in Victoria, Louis Weir. Have you heard of him? He was quite a capable fellow. He was dismissed from the work over immorality. But he invented the idea that the last power here in verse 45, he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. He invented the idea that that was the papacy. Pastor O.K. Anderson was working with him at the time, and he told me all about it. For Louis Weir was studying up men like Grattan Guinness and so on. And Grattan Guinness was very anti-papacy, very anti-papacy. I've got about a dozen of his books. They're well worth reading. But when it comes to prophecy, he's not quite so sure. But he was a good student of history. And he turned every prophecy into against the papacy. And he applied this. And it didn't take on too well. But Desford picked up Louis Weir's idea on the king of the north and taught it to the students. I know, for I've had many discussions with Desford over it. And today you'll find that nearly all the young workers believe that the closing verses of Daniel 11 is talking about the papacy. It's become very popular. Now, some years ago, when they were pushing it, and they were nearly all preaching on it, in fact, it's almost becoming worldwide. Because, you see, when Louis Weir died, La Rondelle of the Andrews University copyrighted Louis Weir's publications. And he is teaching it at the Andrews University and circulating Louis Weir's books from there until they're everywhere. And the majority of our men today will tell you that the closing verses is talking about the papacy. And as they were all talking about it, I thought, well, there might be something in it. You know, if it was dealing with the papacy, I could get up and preach very easily. He shall come to his end, and none shall help him. I could say, may God hasten the day. But I have no brief for the papacy, none whatsoever. So I thought, I'll try it. So I swatted up their points, and I got up and I preached one night years ago that the king of the north was the papacy. I went home afterwards and read the prophecy, and I had such a bad conscience I vowed I'd never do it again. For the facts just rebel against it. notice one or two points, and then we'll have a look at it. Verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Did Egypt ever fight the papacy? Never. Did she fight France? Absolutely. And if you want something interesting, I think you'll find that great controversy throws some light on it. And the king of the north shall push at him. You see, that happened. But it didn't happen to the papacy. That was number one. When you come down a little bit farther, verse 42, he shall stretch forth his hand also unto the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But the papacy never dominated Egypt. Never. And he shall enter the glorious land, and so on. These were facts that just balked me. Now, what it is talking about, you see, as France came down and swallowed those countries up and dominated, the power that broke the power of the papacy, you have these other powers mentioned which are Mohammedan powers. You've got Egypt, verse 41. He shall enter also into the glorious land. Now, what power dominated Palestine, the glorious land, for hundreds of years? It was political Mohammedanism, wasn't it? Not the papacy. For Mohammedanism dominated the papacy right down until recent years. And the king of the north, up here in Assyria and Turkey and so on, what power dominates? It's Mohammedanism. It binds them all together. Now, when Uriah Smith wrote his excellent thoughts on Daniel and Revelation, he applied this to Turkey, you see, and rightly so, because at that time the Sultan of Turkey was not merely the Sultan of Turkey, but he was the head of the Mohammedan Empire, the whole lot, just as the Pope is the king of Vatican City, but he's also the head of the whole of the Roman Catholic religion. Isn't that so? So you've got it in Mohammedanism. The Sultan of Turkey was the head. Now, in 1922, the Sultan of Turkey had to flee for his life on board a British dreadnought. And the Sultan of Turkey ceased to exist. There's no Sultan of Turkey. Turkey still exists as a very minor point, a very minor power. But is Mohammedanism still here? With a vengeance. And it's a power to be reckoned with. There's at least 700 million Mohammedans in the world, and they'll fight like tigers. They're fanatical. They'll fight. They'll walk out in the face of bullets. And you won't find too many Australians that would do what Mohammedans do to advance their kingdom. Now, as I said, when Uriah Smith applied it to Turkey, he was right. But I would never apply it to Turkey today, because Turkey has crumbled down to nothing at all. But Mohammedanism is still here. You get it? And it's very, very powerful. And as you mentioned the other day, you had it written in your Bible, it was Mohammedanism. You got it quite correct, for that's what it's dealing with. Now you follow on, and you've got it. Because when France pulled out of those territories, Mohammedanism took over. And Mohammedanism has swallowed up Egypt, Palestine, all the Palestinians largely, Jordan, Turkey, Syria, Afghanistan, Iran. In fact, all of that territory, and it's spreading. And it's one of the biggest problems that we face today. We talk about the papacy. But do you know that we baptize probably 100,000 Catholics to every one that we get from Mohammedans? They're very nearly impossible to win. And if you win a Mohammedan and he's baptized, he'll most likely disappear. They get rid of him. It's a problem. And as people have said to me, if the Bible doesn't deal with Mohammedanism, it should. And it certainly does. If I had time, I could show it to you in Revelation and so on. Now, here's the power that is dominating there in the Middle East and in the territory of Palestine. Take verse 44. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Trouble this power that is dominating in Palestine. You think for a moment, what is north of Syria and Turkey and so on? You're running into Russia. East of Palestine, you're into Mohammedan countries, Persia, Afghanistan, right over into India. Pakistan is Mohammedan, and there's millions of Mohammedans over there in India. I talked with some of those Arabs in Palestine, and they said, you British, you white people are forcing us into the hands of Russia. They don't want communism. You see, communism is atheistic, and they don't want communism. They don't want Russia. But the West is supporting Israel. United States is supporting Israel. We noticed it the other day. You see, they do it for votes in America. And Britain and Australia is just toddling along behind America. And they're supporting. And they said, the trouble is you are pushing us into the hands of communists. We don't want communism. We don't want Russia. But you're pushing us in. Tidings out of the east and out of the north are troubling us. For east of Palestine, you've got communism in China and those great eastern masses. In the north, you've got hundreds of millions of communists. Is that so? Tidings out of the east and out of the north are troubling us. Is that so of the papacy? It's not so at all. It just doesn't fit in. But you can see that. How carefully. Tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble us, shall trouble them. And when they get worried, therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away. When people are hopeless, they'll do anything. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas. You see, here you've got Palestine again. Here's Palestine coming down. And over here is the Dead Sea. Here is the Sea of Galilee, and so on. Here is Jerusalem. He would plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea. He would plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. For the glorious holy mountain is Jerusalem, the mount where the temple was once built. He shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, and he's done it. For Mohammedanism has put up the two palaces, the Dome of the Rock and the Mosque of Al-Aqsa. If you want to see a beautiful building, probably the most beautiful building on the face of this earth is the Dome of the Rock. Beautiful. And it's built there, and they'll die for it. For the second holiest spot in the world to the Mohammedans is the old holy mountain, the temple area. For there they told me that Muhammad on his horse leapt home to heaven. They showed me the footprint on the rock, and they built this beautiful mosque over it. And when you go into the mosque, there's nothing but a stone from which Muhammad leapt home to heaven on his horse. I said, brother, he had some steed. Make a mess of the Melbourne Cup, wouldn't it? But that is the second holiest spot in the world. People tell me that soon the Jews with a bulldozer will push it down and build a temple. You ever heard them talking about building a temple in Jerusalem? I tell you, the Second World War will look like a picnic in comparison to what will happen if they interfere with the Dome of the Rock. He shall come to his end, and none shall help him. History has been fulfilled. Right down there to the middle of verse 45. He shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. He's done it. They're there, have been in them. But he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. That's future. How it'll happen, I don't know. Brother Foster told me to tell the experience I told over the phone. For people want to know how he'll come to his end. How will Mohammedanism come to his end? And none shall help him. I don't know. You see, that's future prophecy, and we don't know the details. But I told him an experience that illustrates how Mohammedanism could come to his end. When I was in Damascus, I went into the big mosque. It's a mammoth place. It was originally a Catholic cathedral called St. Sophia, the same as in Constantinople. You remember St. Sophia there, another big Catholic cathedral that became a Mohammedan mosque. The Mohammedans swept through there and they wiped out so-called Christianity, and they took the big cathedrals and they made mosques out of it. And this big mosque in Damascus was known as St. Sophia. And it's very interesting. It's got two big minarets. You know, the minarets are those long towers. One of them they use for calling the faithful to prayer. It was the only minaret that I have ever known of that had a loudspeaker. They put it over the loudspeaker over Damascus to call the people to prayer. It's a solid Mohammedan country. The other minaret is known as the Jesus Tower. And they told me that when Jesus comes again, for Mohammedans believe that Jesus Christ will come back again to this earth. Muhammad won't, but Jesus will. And they believe that when he comes again, he'll land on that minaret and rule the world from Damascus. And they showed it to me and told me about it. Now, it was remarkable. I was there, I think, on a Wednesday. The Friday before I was there, for the Mohammedans always meet on Friday. The reason for that is when Muhammad started out to preach, the majority of the people were keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. And they did their shopping on Friday, like Adventists do today, to get ready for the Sabbath. And when he went down there, the people were shopping in the markets. So Muhammad started to preach to them. And gradually, the Friday became their day of prayer. It's not a Sabbath, it's their day of prayer. And on the Friday, before I was there, they told me that the mosque was packed with men. There's no religion, there's no women ever allowed in a Mohammedan mosque. They're out of it. In fact, in the Mohammedan religion, it's very doubtful as to whether women will ever be saved. That's pretty apparent. To give you an illustration, I've preached in places and I have women come down after the meeting and they tell me Christianity's all bunkum and other religions is good. You know, I've looked at some of them, I haven't told them, but I felt sorry for them. For they don't know they're born. If they were in some of these Mohammedan countries, it's another story. I've seen it. I've been in Mohammedan homes. A boy, why, he can't do anything wrong. They never rebuke them. If a girl opened her mouth, they'd kick her in the corner. I've seen it. They're just chattel. That's why when they grow into men, they're such explosive, uncontrollable fellows. But I was in Baghdad. Baghdad is the capital of modern Iraq today. And I stayed for a couple of nights with the president of that mission. And he pointed out a house just 2 or 3 doors from where I was staying. He said, "You see that house?" I said, "Yes." He said, "A few days ago, there was quite a bit of excitement." And he said, "I went over to see what was doing. It was a funeral." He said, "In a few minutes, they carried out the corpse, all bound up like a mummy." He said it was the liveliest corpse he had ever seen in his life, for they were wriggling and twisting inside. I said, what would it be? Oh, he said, it'd be a wife. You see, a Mohammedan can marry 4 times. If he's got 4 wives and he wants another one, it's a very simple matter. He's just got to get rid of one and he can marry the other. And no questions are asked. I said, what would they do? Oh, he said, they'd take her out into the desert or hit her on the head and bury her. What are you getting excited about? It's only a wife. That's Mohammedanism. And that was in Baghdad in recent years. Now, in the Mohammedan mosques, there are no women. And the place was packed with men. they told me. And the priest was about to step up onto the high pulpit and preach. And as he was about to stand up, for I saw the pulpit, I was right there beside it, I suppose it'd be 12 or 15 foot high. And he was about to go up the steps into this pulpit to preach, when he got a fright, for there was a being in white beside him, and he was terrified. And this being said, don't be frightened. Tell the people that Jesus Christ is coming again, and coming soon. And that Friday, the Friday before I was there, that priest climbed up into that pulpit and preached for a solid hour on the soon coming of Jesus Christ. Now you can explain it how you like, but the newspapers were full of the story. I'd have brought them home with me, only they were all written in Arabic and nobody could read them any rate. But that's what they told me, and that was the explanation. Now, you can see when the devil comes and appears as an angel of light, a being in dazzling brightness, the Mohammedan world that are looking, they've rejected Christianity, but they are looking for a being of majestic majesty, coming again under the name of Christ. When the devil appears as Christ, the Mohammedan world could fall at his feet in mass. Isn't that so? And Mohammedanism would have ceased. He shall come to his end. He's planted the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. And at that time, the next verse says, shall Michael stand up. What's that? That's the close of probation. Isn't it wonderful? Now, I've noticed that one of the main objections that are given to the lineup that I have given this afternoon is the statement that all prophetic periods in Daniel terminate with Rome. This one in Daniel 11 terminates in Jerusalem. Is that so? But they tell me that all the prophetic periods in Daniel terminate with Rome. So we'll have a look and we'll see, and I'll show you some very interesting things when we get through. Come back to Daniel 2 and see where this one terminates. But you know, there's a lot of statements made. It's easy to make the statement, it's another thing to confirm it. Daniel chapter 2, and we'll just have a Bible study now and see where this gets us to. Daniel chapter 2, and I'm reading to you verse 44. Now they tell me that all these prophecies finish with Rome, so it's a good thing when you hear people make statements is to check it up and notice where these prophecies end. Verse 44, for you're coming down to the end. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. That's the kind of a kingdom you need, isn't it? Which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Then this kingdom will stand forever. Now, where will that kingdom be? In Rome? Doesn't sound. This is the termination of that prophecy. I'll show you in a moment exactly where that kingdom will be centered. Chapter 7. Here's the next great prophecy. You remember that covers those four beasts. Verse 26 of Daniel 7. Verse 25, you remember, deals with the power that would change times and laws and so on. You're under no illusion there. Verse 26, but the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion. Whose dominion? The papacy's in Rome, centered there in Rome. Shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom, here's the kingdom again, and the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the saints, to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. And all dominion shall serve and obey him Isn't that wonderful? Now, is that in Rome? You see, fellas, even some Adventists make some very silly statements. That certainly is not Rome, is it? We'll see in a moment where it is. Chapter 9, here you have another prophecy. Chapter 9 and verse 26. They all culminate in the kingdom. Now here's the prophecy that is dealing with the 70 weeks and so on. Verse 26. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince, who was that? That was Titus. Remember I told you about how Titus was the son of Vespasian and took over the army when Vespasian went back to Rome to be the emperor. This was Titus, the son of the emperor. And the people of the prince, for Titus was the prince at that time. That was the Roman people under Titus. The people of the prince shall come and shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. When was that? That was in AD 70, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. And the people of the prince shall come and shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. It certainly was with a flood of blood. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Who was that? Jesus. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. That's when he terminated the Jewish sacrifices. And it's significant, from AD 70, the Jews have never offered a blood sacrifice. As I told some of those Jewish fellows when I was talking to them in Jerusalem, I said, there couldn't be any salvation in your religion. There is no salvation in the Jewish religion, because your own Bible said it is the blood that maketh an atonement. But you don't offer a blood sacrifice. You don't accept the blood of Jesus, and you don't even have a blood sacrifice. And if it's the blood that makes an atonement, your own Bible, the Old Testament, says that. Where's your salvation? That's a good question for Jews, isn't it? It's a good question. He shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and Jesus did. It's finished. Cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abomination he shall make it desolate even unto the consummation. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Now, where did that happen? That was in Jerusalem. You see, these prophecies all end in Jerusalem. None of them end in Rome. And yet everywhere I go, I hear Adventists that want to make the papacy the king of the north. They say they all terminated in Rome. But actually they terminate in Jerusalem. But come over here now to Ezekiel. And here's 1 or 2 verses. You may want to mark some of them because they're good to have in your Bible. Ezekiel chapter 5 and verse 5. Chapter 5 of Ezekiel and verse 5. 5:5. Thus saith the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set it in the midst of the nations and the countries that are round about her. God said of Jerusalem, we'll draw our sketch again, the Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, the Jordan, and here's Jerusalem. And God said he had set Jerusalem in the midst of the nations. Actually, Jerusalem is set there at the crossroads of the nations. The 3 great continents all meet right there. And if you were coming from the east and heading west, you came right through this territory. Because you can't go down here, you're running into desert and difficulties, mountains up on the top. They came through here. And if you were coming from the north down to the south, you came through here. And God put them right there at the crossroads of the nations. And that is the center of the three great religions in the world. The Jewish religion, they all look to Jerusalem, don't they? The Christian religion looks to Jerusalem as the holy city, and the Mohammedans. It's the hub. They all want it. You get it? And God said, this is Jerusalem. I have set it in the midst of the nations. That word midst is the same word as often translated center. But it's very significant. As I mentioned a few moments ago, they have regarded Jerusalem from time immemorial as the center or the heart of the earth. We don't often hear it, but it's a fact. As I mentioned that old map in the Hereford Museum, I always remember Hereford by the Hereford cattle. You know, these white-faced beef cattle. Because I grew up on the west coast of South New Zealand, and they bred plenty of beef cattle, and they were all Herefords. That's how I remember it. So if you want to remember the Hereford Cathedral, remember the Hereford cattle. It might help you. And there they've got this old map. They told me it went back to the times of the Crusades. And they've got Jerusalem in the center of the earth with circles running around it. The center of the earth. And in Jerusalem, they'll tell you that that's been the center of the earth. And when God said, this is Jerusalem that I put in the midst or the center of the world, you remember when the Jews got scattered and they were to pray, they prayed towards where? Jerusalem. Daniel did. You see, you've got Jerusalem here, and you've got like a great prayer circle around, and they're all focusing in on Jerusalem. Isn't that so? It's significant. And as you go through the Bible, to notice how Jerusalem is the center. It was the center of religion. Christ was there. All the Bible writers were around that territory. It's the hub. All the way through. In fact, do you know Mediterranean means the central sea? It's the very center. And it's the center of the three great continents, the three great religions. In fact, I notice archaeologists, they talk about the Fertile Crescent, where mankind began. And they will run like a great crescent right across. You see, here was Babylon over here, and they will draw a great crescent like this. They call that the Fertile Crescent. That's where mankind began. Back here in Babylon, the Garden of Eden was evidently over in this area. And here you've got Egypt, and this was the Fertile Crescent, and right in the very center of it is Palestine and Jerusalem. That's where mankind began. That's where mankind will end. They'll terminate there. The wicked will terminate forever in that same area, as we'll notice in a moment. They began there, they end there. The first advent of Jesus was centered in that part of the earth. Is that so? And the last spot that the feet of Jesus touched on this earth was the Mount of Olives. Isn't that so? The very spot overlooking Jerusalem. I climbed up there onto the Mount of Olives and sat on the rock on the top. It might have been the very rock from which Jesus stepped when he raised his hands in blessing and started back to heaven. And when Jesus comes back to this earth and his feet touch this earth again, it'll touch the Mount of Olives. The very same spot. Come over to Zechariah. Zechariah, about the second to last book in the Old Testament. Working back, you've got Malachi and then Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4. Zechariah 14, verse 4. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, towards the east and towards the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove towards the north, and half towards the south. Then it goes on, and ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for shall reach unto Azel. Yea, ye shall flee, like as ye fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzzah, the king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with you. Now, when will Jesus come with the saints? When he comes the next time, it's with the holy angels to gather up his saints. Isn't that so? But when will he come with his saints? At the close of the 1,000 years, with the saints of God in the New Jerusalem, it comes down onto this earth, and then evidently Jesus goes ahead, and his feet touch on the Mount of Olives, the same spot that he left. And it splits in two, and on that new soil rests the New Jerusalem. Significant, isn't it? And the city is called what? The New Jerusalem. The same name on the same spot, and it's called the same thing. The New Jerusalem. Isn't it wonderful? Right there on that spot. And they were all to pray towards Jerusalem. And as you follow through Zechariah 14, it's very interesting. In fact, I wrote a leaflet on Zechariah 14. If you drop me a line, I'll send it to you. I've still got some of them, I'm sure. In fact, I had a young worker with me, and I gave him a copy when I wrote it, and he thought it was wonderful. And he took about 3 prayer meetings. And I met him. He's just come back from America. He's got some degrees now, but he tells me he preaches 3 sermons from Zechariah 14, the notes that I wrote up on it. It's wonderful. In fact, notice just a couple of places in regard to this. Verse 8, and it shall be in that day that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem. What is that? That's the river of life, isn't it? Which is by the tree of life in the city of God, the New Jerusalem. It's in the city. Verse 9, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth in that day. Is that so? When Jesus comes, he's king. All the world is under one flag, under the Lord Jesus Christ. And so you can go on through here. Verse 12 is a solemn verse. And this shall be the plague wherewith the Lord shall smite all the people that have fought against Jerusalem, fought against the truth. Their flesh shall consume away while they stand upon their feet. And their eyes shall consume away in their holes, and their tongue shall consume away in their mouth. That's the judgment at the close of the 1,000 years. When they come up, you remember, and it says fire came down from God out of heaven. We'll all be there, friends. Every last one of us. Your uncles, your aunts, your mother, your brother, your sister, your father, your enemies, your friends will all be there. Everybody will be there. They'll either be inside Jerusalem or they'll be outside. Is that so? We'll all meet. We'll all be there, either inside or outside. And when fire comes down to eat up the wicked, there you have a description. It just eats them away. Verse 16, and it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations that came against Jerusalem shall even go from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and keep the Feast of Tabernacles. That's the marriage supper of the Lamb. And the people that are left are the redeemed. Is that so? Verse 20, in that day shall be bells upon the horses, holiness unto the Lord. For the only people that are there are holy people. Without holiness, Hebrews 12 says what? No man shall see God. Holiness will be there. Holiness everywhere. Verse 21, Yea, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judea shall be holiness unto the Lord of hosts. And all they that sacrifice shall come and take them and see therein. And in that day there shall be no more of the Canaanites in the house of the Lord of hosts. The Canaanites were those that fought against God. Isn't that so? And sometimes you get Canaanites into the church. But there'll be no more Canaanites in the church of God on that day. None whatsoever. They'll be gone. Is that clear? I picked this statement from Sister White. The Mount of Olives was the favorite resort of the Son of God. That's in the book That I May Know Him, page 258. The Mount of Olives was the favorite spot. And it's interesting, it was the last spot that the feet of Jesus touched before he ascended back to heaven. And it's the first spot that the feet of Jesus will touch when his feet touch this earth again. And it's significant. It was there that Jerusalem was set up, and throughout the ceaseless ages of eternity, Jerusalem will not merely be the center of the earth, it'll be the center of the universe. It's important. You know, when I listen to the news, I listen to the news about Jerusalem and Palestine more than anything else. For that is the hub of the prophecies of the Bible. That will be the eternal hope. If you doubt it, come over here to Revelation 21 and have a look at it. Revelation 21, verses 1 to 5. Notice it. Revelation 21. And we are reading verse 1 and on, just to get the context. Revelation 21. Come right up, sister. Special favorites up here in the front seat. I like to get people close to me. Revelation 21, verse 1. Have you got it? And I saw new heavens and a new earth. And the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem. Then the name Jerusalem will last forever. Is that so? Significant, isn't it? The New Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them. And they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. Wonderful.
This message continued on the next tape in this series.